Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be taking a look at the water energy nexus and why it's important for business and some of the practical solutions to it that are emerging. My name is Stephen Kennett and I look after the water risk management channel here at 2 Degrees. I'm delighted to welcome our two presenters today. Joining us from Atkins we have Nathan Richardson, Director of Water and Environment, and also Jeff Dark, Head of Climate Futures. Today's presentations will last around 30 minutes, which will leave us with 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. Just type in your question and press send, and then we'll wait till the end before answering as many as we can. As an aside, if you should have any technical issues during the webinar, please use the chat box on the right-hand side to send me a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Nathan, who will get us started with today's presentation. So Nathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and welcome to everyone to our webinar this afternoon. I'm Nathan Richardson, Director at Atkins within the Water and Environment team, and I'm interested in the interdependency of water and energy risks because both these resources are fundamental to our way of life and our future. I'm concerned that if we only consider these resources separately, we're going to fail to recognise the full exposure of businesses and our communities to water and energy risks, particularly over the longer term. With me today is Jeff Dark, who heads up our Climate Change and Environmental Futures business. So today's webinar is going to be split into three sections. Firstly, I'm going to explain what the water energy nexus is, and I'll talk a bit about water energy nexus risks and how they can affect businesses both now and in the future. I'll explain why I think businesses need to go beyond just looking at direct short-term operational issues and consider strategic long-term water and energy risks. I'll then hand over to Jeff, who will take you through a number of case studies pertinent to water energy nexus issues, each of which looks at the issue and the solutions at a different scale. And then building on these examples, we'll end with a few thoughts on how companies can develop a plan for mitigating risks and maximising opportunities associated with water and energy. As Stephen says, there's a bit of time at the end for Q&A, and you can use the chat area to submit questions as we move through the presentation. So what is the water energy nexus? Well, the phrase water energy nexus started to appear in the literature in about 2007, 2008, but it really jumped to prominence in 2009, 2010, as the then UK government chief scientist and others started to highlight the perfect storm of future pressures that are facing society and our planet. Not only is the global population rising, how we choose to live is changing. People are increasingly concentrated in urban areas, and we're seeing a rising middle class emerging in many regions. People are living longer, and we're increasingly faced with a challenge over access to and allocation of scarce resources. In many regions of the world, we're already experiencing energy poverty and water scarcity. For example, more than a third of the world's population, about 2.8 billion people, live in water-stressed countries, and by 2025, the number is expected to rise to 2/3 of the population. Around 2.5 billion people currently have unreliable or no access to electricity. The physical environment is changing too. We know we're going to experience some degree of climate change due to historic emissions and the lag in the climate system. And around the globe, we're going to have to adapt to changing temperatures and rainfall patterns, which will affect water availability, as well as more extreme events such as flooding and drought. To mitigate against future climate change and further climate change, we're going to need to decarbonise our future energy generation systems and also increase the efficiency of how we use energy. So as a society, we face significant water and energy changes and challenges into the future. The challenges and many of the solutions are linked and the relationship between the two is the water energy nexus. And we've got the World Bank definition here. Basically, the water energy nexus is all about the interdependence of energy and water. Energy needs water. Over 90% of global power generation is water intensive, particularly nuclear, coal, oil and gas, including shale gas, biofuels and obviously hydropower. Our power sector is largely designed for a water-rich world. However, total energy-related water demand is set to double by 2035. Looking at water, then water needs energy. It needs energy for abstraction, treatment and distribution, and it needs energy for its use through processes such as heating and cooling. So energy needs water and water needs energy. And when we look at how we use both resources, the solutions we develop need to be joined up. And business, as a major user of both water and energy, has a key role to play in the Nexus challenge, both in recognizing and addressing the risks faced, but also in taking opportunities that may emerge. The Nexus is important to business because decisions made on either water or energy can have significant effects on the other. And Jeff will run through some case studies of this later in the webinar. These effects can be positive or negative. For example, measures to reduce water use may also save energy. However, efforts to improve water quality may demand more energy. Investing in solar photovoltaics as a local energy source could reduce your water footprint. These impacts and interactions can occur in the short and longer term. Unforeseen issues can arise years after major investments have been made in either energy provision or water supply, potentially creating stranded assets. This slide highlights a number of these interconnections and how they've resulted in impacts either on water availability or on energy production or on agriculture. Many of these impacts were not anticipated because the Nexus linkages and risks were not considered when the investment decisions were made, or when the assets were constructed, or when significant operational decisions were made. So why haven't the links between water and energy why have they received so little attention when the risks can be significant? And I think in large part it's because there are such differences between water and energy in how they're generated and supplied, how they're regulated, what they cost, how we pay, how we measure their use and efficiency, and what we focus on. For example, we tend to focus on the volatility of prices when we look at energy, whereas it's usually the availability of water. And there are also differences in who's responsible, from government right down to business. So water and energy have been compartmentalized from top to bottom. The ironic thing is that I'll be speaking at the 2 Degrees Resource Efficiency Summit on the Water Energy Nexus later this month. And even in that enlightened event, the water people will be in one room for part of the day, and the energy people will be in another room. But it's not all doom and gloom. While many governments and policymakers have been slow to take on board the energy-water nexus and to act, a number of leading businesses are forging ahead and making the link between their water and their energy footprint and transferring this understanding into action. However, there's a long way to go. We encourage our clients and contacts to think about water and energy in 4 dimensions, to look beyond their current resource use and efficiency within the factory gate. The first dimension is to consider the breadth of risks and opportunities around water and energy: physical, financial, regulatory, and reputational. The second dimension is spatial. There's a need to think about Nexus issues beyond the factory gate. The level of risk a company faces and the opportunities available will depend on the location in which it's sited and where those activities take place, particularly for water. So, for example, the impact of water abstraction will depend on the availability of water within that catchment. The effect of a discharge is linked to the quality of the receiving water. And also catchments can be characterised by different stakeholders with different interests and needs. The third dimension to look at is vertical. So looking at water and energy issues through the lens of your suppliers, customers and investors, as well as your own operations. Your business is no doubt indirectly exposed to water and energy nexus risks through the supply chain. If you're to truly understand your exposure and the opportunities that are out there, you need to also look at your suppliers as well as your own operations. A great example of this was the Thai floods in 2011, which rippled through the international supply chain, disrupting supplies and logistics of around 14,000 companies worldwide and leading to the insurance industry's highest recorded flood loss event. In the UK, Honda cut production of its Swindon plant by around 50% and had to delay the launch of a new model. The final fourth dimension is time, looking at how water and energy nexus risks and opportunities may change in the future. However, relatively few businesses are looking at their resilience beyond the near-term horizon and integrating thinking on how they'll adapt to and manage longer-term water and energy nexus risks into their business strategy and their investment planning. I believe that given the scale of the challenges and the pace of change, much more attention needs to be given to understanding these future risks. So I'll now pass over to Jeff, who's going to take us through a number of case studies and also we'll highlight some initial steps that could be taken for any organisation that wants to get to grips with their water and energy risks.
Thanks, Nathan, and good afternoon, everybody. What Nathan has highlighted in the first part of this webinar is why businesses should be thinking about the water-energy nexus, the linkages between their water and energy management, and their risks. Now we will provide some examples of solutions and opportunities that have emerged in a number of the projects that we have been undertaking over the last year to address the water-energy nexus challenges. These examples cover a range of scales, from horizon scanning through to strategy development, investment planning, and at the individual site scale. At Atkins, we have a future-proofing program in which we are looking at the integrated challenges of resource scarcity, climate change adaptation, and also the movement to a low-carbon economy. Last year, we published Future-Proofing the UK Water Sector with our partner Decision Strategies International. This examined a number of drivers and trends within the water sector and identified two of these as particularly important and also uncertain. The first was the price and availability of energy, and the second was the value that society places on resources. We used these two drivers, energy and societal value on resources, to create 4 different scenarios describing what the UK water industry could plausibly look like in the year 2050. From this, we were able to identify a number of no-regrets pathways that can be taken today to prepare for an uncertain tomorrow. Understanding the linkages between water and energy really helps us to think through future challenges and opportunities. The next example looks at how an organisation considered the nexus in its strategy development. As a public body, the police have a statutory duty under the 2003 UK Water Act to take into account water conservation. We were commissioned to help the regional force in the UK develop a strategy to improve water efficiency across their estate. The Atkins team worked with the water management charity Waterwise to understand how water was used across the whole estate, which ranged from police stations to stables and included a very transient workforce. It quickly became apparent that if the water efficiency strategy was targeted at hot water users, then multiple benefits could be gained from reduced water and energy use. Although we were commissioned to look at water efficiency, we were able to grab the opportunity to provide a synergy of options targeted at hot water users, which will reduce both water and energy use. The client was pleased, as this provides multi-win strategies providing larger financial, public responsibility, reputational, and environmental benefits. The third example considers integration of the Nexus into investment planning. We provided energy efficiency guidance to a major industrial water user who currently spends 20% of their operational budget on energy. Through various energy improvement projects, we were able to develop an implementation plan with annual savings. This project allowed us to provide energy savings from a variety of water interventions. These included things like pumping, treatment, and demand management. We provided a program of investment based on the greatest savings achievable, as well as on the quickest payback. And the table here shows that significant savings could be made with paybacks of typically around 4 years. The fourth case study is at the site level. The need to dissipate waste heat from buildings is a growing issue. As rising atmospheric temperatures lead to warmer river temperatures and water quality regulations become more stringent, disposing of waste heat provides a significant challenge for companies, especially in our big cities. A number of questions are raised. For example, will water bodies be able to absorb the quantity of heat in future? If your company can't dissipate this heat, will you have to reduce production? Or will you have to reduce the numbers of staff in your office block if you can't get rid of the waste energy from computers, heating, air conditioning, and hot water use? In response to this, we have been modelling these kind of impacts and also looking at solutions. We found that we can actually turn this into an opportunity. Excess heat can be reused in district heating, where the energy is rerouted and used to heat other buildings. Then it will be cooled in a useful way, ready to be returned to the environment. So really, it's a win-win. The use of water itself for heating, thereby displacing or reducing other sources of energy, has been considered recently by the UK Department for Energy and Climate Change. The final example demonstrates the role of international bodies and investors. We are working internationally with several organisations that are at the forefront of the water energy nexus. International investors and banks are already stipulating the need for companies to declare their water energy resilience. For example, large multinational banks like HSBC and Standard Chartered have issued position statements outlining their future consideration of water-related risks when making investment decisions. We're also working with the European Union, looking at a multi-million-pound programme of investment in sustainable energy solutions in sub-Saharan Africa, an area which also faces significant water challenges. As part of that work, we reviewed the water energy nexus connections and provided guidance to the EU on how they can account for the nexus in appraising investment opportunities. This report also informed their position at the recent World Water Week held annually in Stockholm, which this year was on the topic of the water energy nexus. Hopefully these case studies have shown how you can look at the water energy nexus issues at a range of scales, from horizon scanning through to setting strategy, planning investments, or indeed looking at opportunities at a single site. So, what could you do next? Firstly, we found that it's really important to continue to drive water and energy efficiencies. Being more efficient reduces the nexus risks, as well as being better for the environment and the bottom line. Key actions include monitoring, integrating energy and water data, and identifying investment and saving win-wins. Secondly, it's useful to remember the 4 dimensions that Nathan ran through. Thinking and acting broadly, spatially, vertically through supply chains, and especially temporally, will help integrate nexus issues and maximize opportunities. We also hope the case studies have provided some practical examples and inspiration to managing this real business issue. So that concludes the presentation element, and we now have time for questions. So I'll hand back to you, Stephen, to chair this part of the webinar.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff, and thanks, Nathan, as well for the presentations. So we'll go into the Q&A session now, and I'll just remind everybody attending that you can keep sending your questions in now using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So a question maybe to begin with, and Nathan, you might want to pick up on this one first. But you touched on this, but someone's asking any tips on how to engage senior management on this energy-water dilemma. And I don't know if you've kind of got any insights in how you might sell this to them as a approaching problem.
Thanks, Stephen. I think, I mean, in our experience, if you come at this just in terms of efficiency, particularly in terms of water efficiency, then it's quite a difficult sell because the economics are difficult. The amount of investment you have to put in to save water, because the cost of water is very low, it's quite difficult to make a case that is particularly engaging to senior management. If you start to draw energy in, and we have the case study of the police force, where measures looking at addressing water issues also resulted in energy savings, then it starts to become a better financial case. Moving beyond that and moving beyond efficiency, then I think once you start to look at risks and exposure and resilience in the longer term, then by going through that process, you can inform a much more sort of robust case that you can put through to your senior management. I mean, there are some very useful publications out there. So, for example, the CDP water report that they undertake on behalf of investors. So they basically pull together through a questionnaire which goes to most of the top 500 listed companies around the world. They ask those companies about their water, how they're managing water risks, and they challenge them how they're doing it at the moment, how they're doing it, how they're looking at future risks. That report and that work is driven by investors, and there's a lot of increased emphasis from investors now to focus more actively, for businesses to focus more actively on their water and energy risks. So I think that's where I'd probably stop. I think have a look at start from the water risks side of things. If you consider the Nexus issues, then that can help make the economic case. If you consider energy as well alongside it, but take a broad perspective. Don't just look at efficiency.
Great, thank you, Nathan. A sort of follow-up question to that. Someone's asking, and I'm assuming this is talking about the UK, but is there existing or any upcoming legislation which is going to drive greater change in this area?
Well, there is in terms of on the water side of things. We're looking at legislation around water allocation. So at the moment, water is licensed often in by right on a volume that is sort of guaranteed, almost whatever the environmental conditions. The government is currently consulting on a change in how it licenses water abstraction, and that would mean the licenses would be linked to availability. So when the water wasn't available in the environment, the volume of water that you could abstract and use would be reduced. So there are changes, very slow progress, and I think most of the activity, most of the progress has actually really been made by the companies, and the legislation is sort of playing catch up to some extent.
Great, thanks, Nathan. Jeff, I'm not sure if you want to tackle this one, but from a water perspective, what's the most sustainable energy source?
Well, I think it's a good question. It's hard to be quite general about that, I think. We found in our case studies and so on that we need to look at the nature of what's available locally, what the demand is, how does that demand peak, and so on. So there's quite a few factors that would need to be considered within that. So it is important, going back to the point that Nathan made earlier about thinking in the 4 dimensions, it is important to consider that question over those 4 dimensions, so particularly in terms of supply chain. So it might not just be what you're doing, but it's what your suppliers and downstream people are doing. But also it's important to think spatially in terms of where you're getting this from. Can you generate the energy locally? If you've got to bring it in from further afield, are you incurring losses and so on? So it needs to be thought of fairly holistically, rather than there being a kind of a single silver bullet.
Well, perhaps I can add a bit to that. In terms of water use, then the nuclear, coal, gas and oil, they all use a lot of water. You know, they need about 500 or 600 gallons of water per megawatt hour, and I think biofuels are similar level, and that doesn't include the water that you actually need to grow the crop. And interestingly, if you add carbon capture, which is very much on the agenda these days, that can actually increase the water demand by more than 30%. So the traditional energy sources are all pretty water intensive, as I flagged up in the webinar. Some of the more newer renewable energy technologies, particularly the ones that don't have sort of thermoelectric processes, have minimal requirements for water for energy generation. So if you looked at it from a water perspective, then generating energy from solar photovoltaics, for example, or from wind, would be the most sustainable choice. They have the lowest operational water consumption and life cycle water footprints.
Thanks, Nathan. Another sort of follow-on question to that then is, someone's asking, does planning need to play a part? For example, power plants near the coasts that utilise seawater more.
Perhaps if I kick this one off, and then maybe Jeff can come in. Desalination could be a really big option in terms of water supply in the future. But at the moment, it's very energy intensive. So, for example, I think Saudi Arabia uses over 1 billion barrels of oil a day to power its desalination plants. So that's a big drawback at the moment. But there's recent sort of advances in the technology around solar have meant much better efficiencies and lower unit costs. So countries like Saudi Arabia, they're investing in linking desalination to solar energy. And, as much as 68 gigawatts of solar photovoltaic generation capacity might be installed over the next 20 or 30 years. So that's a big growth area. And places like California are developing developing solar desalination plants as well that use farm runoff. Planning can be a bit of an issue. I mean, there was something I picked up today in the press where in Japan they're looking at solar energy generation, and because the land space is so limited, they're looking at floating solar on reservoirs and offshore as an energy source. Jeff, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Add a couple of points. I think that planning really does need to play a part. I think there is some discussion now about how Nexus issues could be brought into the strategic environmental assessment and that's SEA and environmental impact assessment EIA processes, which I think would be good. We've also had previous experience helping operators and so on look at where best power plants could be sited, and indeed in general plant could be sited in terms of its water use. So yeah, being near the coast is one factor for certain generation technologies, but with a lot of the new types of technology, they're less water dependent, if you like.
So yeah, we've done a bit of work for the nuclear sector, for example, looking at where you could possibly site nuclear power plants, where you're going to get the water from. You know, there are a very limited number of options actually when it comes down to it because of the water demand of some of these energy generation technologies.
Thanks, Nathan. Another question here. The examples of how the Nexus issues have been examined at different scales are very useful. So the question is, if I want to look at my company's exposure to future longer-term water and energy risks, where should I begin?
Okay, if I tackle that one, I think I would probably start by understanding current footprint and risks, so the ones we've got today, if you like, including the key parts of the supply chain, and any local catchment context is also really important, as we discussed earlier, especially for water, which is highly diverse. And there are a number of different tools out there that can help with that. And then moving on from that, I think it's important then to consider future changes that might occur over, say, the medium, longer term. And this is where things like the scenario planning approach that I introduced as the first case study could be really useful. So looking at what risks and opportunities could emerge over different kind of divergent pathways in future, and then really looking, is there a kind of no regret strategy that that could be robust to those different kind of futures. And then finally, I would suggest you use this information, this understanding, to develop a management plan, setting out how you will avoid or mitigate these risks or maximize opportunities going into the future. And we found that these kind of plans can help people with both their business strategy, but also identify further work, further R&D, for example, that might need to be undertaken to address major uncertainties.
Great, thank you. Another question here is, how big a factor is location when examining the business case? For example, Scotland versus, say, the southwest of England, particularly when you're looking at water costs and availability.
Well, I mean, this is a big issue. I mean, one of the key factors with water is that it's a very heavy medium. So the cost of pumping it over very long distances, both in terms of money, but also in terms of the energy requirements to do that, are very high. So there's a big cost penalty in moving water over a long distance, which of course that constraint does not apply quite in the same way as energy. So location is very important, and it needs to factor in the types of demand that you have on that. So is it a continuous demand? Is it something that can be stored locally or used? What is the quality of the water that you require?
Well, I think the other thing with location is what else is going on locally as well, because it could be that you're in an area where there are rapidly increasing demands for water. So although there may be plenty of water now for your needs, in 5 or 10 years' time, other demands, it could be urban expansion or other industries moving in or changes in agriculture, can change the situation. So you need to understand, as well as the sort of potential cost of moving water, you need to understand what the sort of catchment context is and what future changes you might see. And those are very location specific, I think.
Yeah, we seem to be moving into this potential era of more collaboration around identifying those future risks. We've been involved in Cambridge University's Water Collaboratory, which has been looking at these issues out into the future and looking at different business models where different stakeholders could get involved in funding a reliable future water infrastructure that could be used to support all sorts of different demands, including for energy.
Yeah, so I mean that work was the water company was involved, retailers, growers. It was quite a diverse sort of collaboration, and it was all around how can they find the model that allows them to invest to improve the water security for all of those groups.
Great, thanks, Nathan. And one final question we've got here: are there any obvious opportunities for phasing projects that tackle both energy and water in order to balance the investment and also the planning of these type of solutions?
So around the sort of timing and phasing, well, I think I guess the strategy work that we did for the police force is probably the most relevant. Well, that and the investment planning example are probably the most relevant one. So in the strategy we did with the police force, it was very much about prioritisation. It was looking at where the sort of early wins were, where the biggest sort of payback, and that was why linking their water use to their energy use was so important, because it gave them a much stronger business case to take action sooner rather than later. I think the other example around the investment planning work that we looked at, we looked at a whole sort of raft of different ways which that organisation used water, from how they abstracted it, how they moved it around their operations, how they treated it, how they disposed of it. And we prioritised their interventions based on where they were going to get the biggest energy savings. So not just payback, because you could get a very short payback period, but it actually saves very, very little energy and money. So we also looked at the actual sort of quantum of saving, and that was a tool that helped us prioritise the timing of for that company as to when it was best, what was the optimal sort of investment strategy.
We've also been doing some more work recently following on from some of our scenario planning work. So the scenario planning can help set the long-term risks and long-term pathways in which you can then come up with your more detailed investment plans. And we've also been trialling some new methods recently associated with robust decision-making and real options, which is an economic technique, which actually helps program in investments. And we think that they are robust tools which can help do exactly what the question is asking, identifying when it's best to invest in different interventions.
Thanks, Jeff. So we'll draw today's session to a close now, but I'd like to thank Nathan and Jeff for their time today and for getting through so many questions, and also for everyone who's joined us for this webinar. Just to remind you all, a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will be archived on the 2Degrees platform, and as soon as these go live, I'll send out an email with the links to these. So I hope you found today interesting and useful, and you'll be able to join us in the coming months for further webinars. So thank you, everyone.
Yep, thank you very much.
Thank you.